Good evening! The clock has struck midnight, and it's the time for Warhammer Adventures once more. So ladies and gentlemen, enough of chivalry for now. It's time for chaos! This is a 2,500 point Warriors of Chaos army, led by Golrach, the Dragon of Cheese. I mean change. Anyway, Golrach is a nasty dragon who ate a lot of change and learned how to become a level 4 wizard, and he's got 2 very nasty breath weapons. In his quest for destruction and vengeance, Golrach is ably supported by the battle standard bearer on the right hand side in the orange armour with the Welcome to the Machine banner. He's got Burning Body, a Luckstone and the Enchanted Shield, and goes by the name Lumpsucker. And then our final character is Festus, who is a nasty plague doctor, level 2 wizard on the lore of Nurgle, but more importantly, he gives the unit he's in poisoned attacks and a 5-up regen. My core selection is dominated by one very tough unit, that being 21 Chaos Warriors with the Mark of Nurgle, Chaos Armour, Halberds and full command following the Banner of Swiftness. Then we've got 5 Chaos Hounds whose job it is to get in the way. And then at the back, following the City of Forever banner, 5 Marauder Horsemen with flails and the Mark of Slaanesh. And then to round out my core, a Chaos Chariot with no Mark of Chaos. Moving into special, we've got 5 Hellstriders of Slaanesh with the Who's Afraid of the Dark banner there at the back. Then we've got a big stupid Chimera there at the front. This creature has a nasty habit of running away in the most ignominious situations. Let's see if he does it again tonight. And then finally, because no Chaos Army would be complete without them, we have 4 Chaos Trolls there at the back. And for rare, we've got 3 Skull Crushers of Khorne, riding Juggernauts of Khorne. They've got a Musician and a Standard Bearer. And then finally, we've got Ariadne the Spider. Actually, a great spined chaos beast from the Storm of Magic supplement. This is a nasty monster with lots of wounds, attacks and regen. Despite being very powerful, this army actually works out as a +3 under the Triple Crown comp system, which gives you plus points for things that are reckoned to be harder, minus points for things that are reckoned to be softer. So it's only really a little bit harder than some of the Bretonnian lists I'm using according to that comp system. Right, the wicked forces of chaos are going to be pitted against an army of doughty dwarves led by Terry. So from right to left we have a gyrocopter, then 21 Iron Drakes led by Grim Burluxon. Oh, this guy's nasty, he lets them reroll to hit a lot of the time, and with Iron Drakes that's pretty horrible. Then on the rock there we've got I think about 30 Iron Breakers, and they're led by a massive Dwarf King on some shield bearers with a loadout that I'm not quite familiar with, but suffice to say, I think he's got a 1-up armor save, strength 8, quite a lot of attacks, and D3 wounds. Not the kind of thing we really want to be fighting. Finally in that unit, there's also a battle standard bearer, who's got 3 runes of slowness. These are nasty dwarfy things. What they do is they make your charges slower, means you don't get there and pull up in front of them, and then the dwarves get to charge you, which is not the point of fighting dwarves. Then to the left we've got, I think it's around 18 dwarf crossbowmen. They've also got double-handed weapons as well. Then behind that rock there's a gyro bomber. Then to the left of that there's another unit of 18 dwarf crossbowmen, or brewers, I'm not quite sure exactly what they are. And then finally, because they're not on the board, there are 10 ambushing miners carrying a standard. Terry's list works out as +8 under the Triple Crown comp system, so it's significantly softer than what I'm bringing. Fairly obvious reason for that is because there are no war machines here, even though there's quite a lot of shooting. I should say in this we're also fighting a scenario as well, and this is Breakthrough, which means that if you can get a unit with a standard into the opponent's deployment zone, you count as having broken through, and the player with the most units in his opponent's deployment zone wins that objective, and gets a 500 victory point bonus at the end of the game. Now, I've got standards on my Chaos Warrior unit and on my Juggernaut unit. A lot of the other banners are decorative, I should say. Terry's got standards, I believe, on all of his regiments, including his ambushers. But generally speaking, dwarves aren't very good at breakthrough scenarios because their little legs only have movement 3. The only other piece of housekeeping you need to know before battle commences is the spells. Well, the dwarves don't have any, because they're dwarves. And as for me, well, Gorach takes the full complement of magic pew-pew spells. He's got Bolt of Change, which is a bit like a bolt thrower. Blue Fire of Tzeentch, which is sort of random projectile spell. Pink Fire of Tzeentch, which is a sort of breath weapony thing. And then Infernal Gateway, which is a very big upmarket magic Tzeentchy missile. And then Festus gets the Blades of Putrefaction, which is a buff spell, giving me poisoned attacks or improving poison if I've already got it. And then Plague Wind, which is a little bit like a crappy version of the Purple Sun that works on toughness, so not ideal against dwarves. Oh yes, and before we begin, some of you might have noticed that this whole Chaos Army is from the 1980s, a time when Warhammer and many other things were much better. Anyway, if you want to see more of these miniatures, check out my Instagram page, Oldhammer Power Metal Painting, which is linked to in the description. Right, so here's the setup. Now straight away you can see that there's not really a normal battle line here, and that's because Terry has 3, I believe, Stroller's runes in his army, which means they give dwarf regiments Vanguard, and he Vanguards up the Iron Drakes and the Iron Breakers on top of the hill. This is important because if the dwarves get turn 1, those Iron Drakes are going to be able to shoot, and I've got a lot of regenerating units on that side of the table, whom the Iron Drakes will go through like a hot knife through butter. Now to stop these unexpectedly vanguarding dwarves having it all their own way, I vanguard my own Hellstriders. They're in a conga line. That means if he wants to shoot the trolls, the Nurgle warriors, or Ariadne the spider, he's going to have to go through hard cover. He's probably going to have to shoot those Hellstriders off. Aside from that, looking at the deployment from a Chaos perspective, well, Terry's army is all about small arms shooting. He's got a lot of crossbowmen, but more particularly he's got those Iron Drakes who are going to be re-rolling to hit most of the time because of Grim Burluxon. And I've got a lot of regenerating units which they're going to destroy. That's going to be where I think a lot of the battle is decided. As for those Iron Breakers on the hill, well, I think if my warrior unit could get into them without sustaining damage, we could do quite well. Problem is, that's simply not going to happen given the Iron Drakes where they are and given his others shooting. So I think it's going to be quite easy for me to destroy the crossbow regiments and maybe 1 or 2 other of the lighter units, but I'm going to try and stop the Iron Drakes and the Iron Breakers from doing too much damage on the rest of my army. As for the scenario, I think my Skull Crushers are in an excellent position to be able to break through. Terry is probably going to get an ambushing unit on my side of the table in my deployment zone, however, so I might have to go chasing that later. Even with that ambushing unit, however, I still think this scenario is stacked in my favour. So we move on to Dwarf turn 1 because they've won the roll-off. Immediately I get a rather nasty surprise, because while it's true that I've put those Hellstriders in a nice conga line, that doesn't stop Terry moving his gyro bomber over them and unleashing a barrage of shrapnel. The gyro bomber rolls a 10 on the artillery dice, the maximum possible, and destroys the entire unit of Hellstriders in a devastating bombing run, thus leaving the trolls and the Nurgle warriors staring down the muzzle of those Iron Drakes. The rest of the dwarf movement phase is largely a non-event. The doughty warriors put the kettle on, load up their Iron Drakey guns and crossbows for as nasty a shooting phase as possible. Then the shooting phase comes, and Grim Burluxon allows the Iron Drakes to re-roll their hits. After a devastating volley of fiery hail shot, the entire troll unit lays dead. The Chaos Warriors take a panic test and pass it. Ooh, it's going to be difficult to get into that Iron Drake unit now, because those trolls were one of the faster things on that side. The rest of the dwarf shooting doesn't do a great deal, however, with one of the crossbow units plonking off a wound on the skull crushers. Right, it's on to Chaos turn 1, and we really need to close down these dwarf lines before we get shot to hell and back. So the whole army moves rapidly forwards, with the Chaos Hounds getting in the way of the Iron Drakes to try and block some of their shooting, the Chaos Warriors marching up with their banner of swiftness, and the Marauder Horsemen going and stationing themselves in front of that Ironbreaker unit on the hill, so they won't be able to charge my Chaos Warriors or Gorrach. Ariadne also runs forward, needlessly exposing her flank to the crossbowmen, but why should I be afraid of them? They're crossbow dwarfs. Gorrach also moves forwards, although not as much as the other units, but still far enough to place himself in charge range should he need to in my next turn. On my left flank, the Skullcrushers move up smartly, the chariot trundles along, and the Chimera flies into the ruins to stare at the flank of those dwarf crossbowmen. Onto the Chaos Magic phase then, and Gorrach is left with Tzeentch's dilemma. Now, the problem with the lore of Tzeentch, and one of the reasons why it's not a very often used lore, is that if you damage your opponent with the very wide variety of magic missiles that are in the lore, they take a toughness test, and if they pass it, they get regeneration 6+, if they fail it, they take a bit more damage. Chances are if I do 2 or 3 spells at one of those dwarf units, they're gonna have regen 5+ sooner than you can say Jack Robinson. So Gorrach decides to pick on the gyro bomber that's flown round and destroyed the Hellstriders, just leaving it inside his arc. He tries a couple of spells, the Bolt of Change and the Blue Flower of Tzeentch. These don't really go that well, and the gyrocopter passes its toughness tests but does take 2 wounds in the process. It's still going to be a pain in the arse for me, and it's probably going to go and park itself in front of my Chaos Warriors in the next turn. It's not really going that well for the Warriors at the moment. So, moving on to Dwarf turn 2. And again, we get something of a nasty surprise in the Dwarf movement phase, which is that the crossbowmen, or the brewers as they really are, declare a charge on the side of Ariadne the Spider. They need a 9 to get it, and they do it. That wasn't what I was expecting at all. Generally, infantry avoid the spider like the plague. We'll have to see what happens in the hand-to-hand combat phase, but I have a nasty feeling Ariadne might be in a bit of trouble. In the rest of the movement phase, the ambushers don't come, and the gyrocopter flies itself, as I suspected, in front of the Chaos Warriors to stop them charging the Iron Drakes. Now it's into the shooting phase, and again it's a pretty heavy one from the dwarves. So Grim Burluxon actually messes up his ability this turn, needing a 2+ to get it. But even without it, the Iron Drakes unloading their fiery, strange, pseudo-end-timey gunny things into the Chaos Warriors, going straight through Festus's regen, gun down 8 of the Nurgle Warriors. Come the combat phase, Ariadne the Spider does not fight well. She kills only 3 dwarves with her 7 attacks, her d6 strength 4 spiky stuff, and her thunderstomp. In the meantime, the dwarves manage to inflict 4 wounds on her. She takes a break test on a 3 and sticks. And then, to add insult to injury from the dwarves, she also manages to turn round on a 3 as well and face the action. Nonetheless, I don't think Ariadne is going to be able to stand up to another round of combat. Just to be on the safe side though, the dwarves reform into a slightly deeper formation to give them another rank. Right, on to Chaos turn 2, and the forces of the Dark Gods have really got to do something here, because things aren't going well. So, the Chaos Warriors charge that wounded gyrocopter in front of them. We're just simply going to have to dispose of that, turn round and hope we've got enough left to charge the Iron Drakes in the next turn. For his part, Gorrach flies over the Iron Drakes, perching upon that hill there, ready to let them have it with a breath weapon in the shooting phase. On the left-hand side of the board, with an unearthly and somewhat dated-sounding roar, the Chimera careers into the flank of the dwarf crossbowmen. The Skullcrushers and the Chariot don't bother dicking about with these crossbowmen, they leave it to the Chimera. and move around in front of them, intent on the other side of the battlefield, which is really where the game is going to be decided. The magic phase is an absolute rinse, don't get a spell off. But in the shooting phase, it's time for the breath of cheese, and the Iron Drakes are overwhelmed by a sea of Gorgonzola, Edam, and Cannonbear. After the fumes are cleared, 6 of them lay dead. Not bad, but I have now used Golruch's principal dangerous breath weapon. In the combat phase, the warriors predictably finish off the gyrocopter and turn to face the Iron Drakes. The Chimera eats 4 dwarf crossbowmen, but the steady warriors stick, being as they are steadfast, and turn round to face the beast. Ariadne the Spider rather gets her act together in the combat phase and stamps 7 of the dwarf brewers to death. However, the remaining 10 of them cleave the spider in 2 with their great weapons. Right, on to Dwarf turn 3, and while I would like to be really narrative at this point, it gets a little bit technical. So, see that diagram there? Golruch is actually where that red dice is, because I couldn't balance him on the hill, and this had some consequences. So, the reason those Marauder Horsemen are in front of the Iron Breakers is fairly obvious. If Terry charges me with them, they'll have to align, that is to say, close the door towards the Marauder Horsemen, where they won't be able to hit anything in their overrun. But you see, if Golruch is there right next to their flank, the dwarves aren't actually able to wheel to close the door, which means that I have to wheel to close the door. When we did all the measuring, after several takes, we decided that if the dwarves do wipe the Marauder Horsemen, they would be able to crash into the side of the Chaos Warrior unit. And if that happens, it's good night, sweetie. So sure enough, that's what the dwarves do. With a banging of drums, they career down the hill into the Marauder Horsemen, intent on the side of the Chaos Warrior unit with an overrun. After wiping out the gyrocopter in the last turn, the Chaos Warriors sigh as the gyro bomber plonks itself in exactly the same place. It's chaff chaff and more chaff. In the movement phase, those dwarf crossbowmen who destroyed Ariadne the Spider, you can just see them there behind the City of Forever banner, start marching, intent on getting into my own deployment zone. Below the battlefield somewhere, the miners are having some cartographic catastrophe, and still fail to turn up. Come the shooting phase, the Iron Drakes who have turned round unload into Golruch, and the great Dragon of Chaos screams as he loses 3 wounds. The gyrocopter in front of the Chaos Warriors lets off a devastating steam gun blast and destroys 6 more of the warriors, leaving just a handful left. However, this is also in a certain way arguably the first mistake Terry has made, because he's killed enough Chaos Warriors to thin the ranks such that those Ironbreakers won't connect with them with their overrun when the combat phase comes, assuming they wipe the Marauder Horsemen. I'm really looking very ropey on this side of the board now, there's not much left. Really need to get those Juggernauts and that Chariot and my Chimera into the right hand side of the table, where I'm currently being pounded to death. In the Dwarf combat phase, the Chimera continues to stamp all over the Dwarf crossbowmen, but the doughty warriors still stick with around 8 of them left. For their part, the Iron Breakers and the Dwarf King unfurl some seriously expensive axe real estate and pound the Marauder Horsemen into the dust. However, with no potential overrun path, they instead decide to stand on the hill and turn round to face the Chaos Warriors. With Chaos Turn 3 now approaching, I decide I've got to get a bit inventive. So the Chaos Hounds, which were on the side of the Iron Drakes, have just enough charge arc to swing round into the gyrocopter on the side. As for the Chaos Warriors, while Terry may have chaffed me with the gyrocopter, that doesn't stop my BSB running out of the unit and charging the side of the Iron Drakes. Now, I do know that my BSB has the Burning Body Chaos reward on him, giving him flaming attacks, and the Iron Drakes have got a 2-up ward save against flaming, so it's not a great target in that sense. But with a charge, a side, and in being a BSB, I think I can hold those Iron Drakes up for a bit there and stop another deadly round of shooting, which could well kill Golruch. Meanwhile, those crossbowmen going into my deployment zone are a pain in the proverbials, and the chariot tries a rather hopeful charge on their rear, needing an 11 and not getting it. For his part, Golruch flies over the other side of the Iron Breakers to let them have it with his remaining breath weapon. In the magic phase, Golruch manages to get off the Pink Fire of Tzeentch, which is a flame template spell. He rolls a misfire on it, which is actually perfect, meaning almost all of the Dwarf Iron Breakers get hit. Then I roll for the strength, and the dice comes up a 1. All of the Iron Breakers virtually take strength 1 hits, and I do not a sausage of damage. Meanwhile, Festus also gets the Blades of Putrefaction off on the Chaos Hounds. It's not very often that dogs have a buff spell cast on them, so they must be feeling very special. In my shooting phase, Golruch uses his other breath weapon, and lets rip onto the Iron Breakers with that, destroying 7 with the Dark Fire of Chaos. In the combat phase, even with Blades of Putrefaction, the enhanced Chaos Hounds aren't able to damage the Gyrocopter. It doesn't damage them, and the combat is a wash. The dogs do a combat reform, however, bringing 2 from the sides into the back of the unit to get supporting attacks, come the next combat phase. The Chimera on the other side of the board continues to eat Crossbow Dwarf, and reduces them to just 3 models. However, the impertinent beardlings stick on a 3, and so the Chimera is going to have to waste another turn eating them. Finally, Lumpsucker the BSB attacks the Iron Drakes on the flank, doing no damage, predictably enough given his flaming attacks, but taking nothing in return, winning combat by 1. The Iron Drakes stick and reform to face the Nurgle BSB. Now moving into Dwarf turn 4, the Iron Breakers on the hill turn round to face the Chaos Warriors, or at least what's left of them. The Crossbow Dwarves, who have been marching into my deployment zone, turn round to potentially take the punishment coming to them from the front. And finally, deep below ground, something else happens to those Dwarf miners. Maybe it's not maps this time, but industrial relations, and the Dwarves throw down their tools in protest at their paying conditions. Suffice to say, they're not coming onto the battlefield this turn either. Thankfully this turn there's no shooting, given most of it's in combat and those crossbow dwarves have turned round. The combat phase on the right hand side of the battlefield sees more stalemate, with the dogs and the gyrocopter still failing to damage each other, and likewise the combat between Lumpsucker and the Iron Drakes ends in a no-score draw and there's nothing doing. However, the Chimera on the other side of the table, facing 3 dwarf crossbowmen, suffers an absolutely ignominious defeat, missing with all its attacks and failing to kill anything with its thunderstomp. The dwarves, all 2 of them, have still got a banner, and they wave it in the Chimera's face. This vicious fluttering of cloth somehow reminds the Chimera of something deeply unpleasant when it was back in the nasty Chaos Wizard's clone lab. With a pathetic howl, it fails its break test and flees towards the table edge, with its 2 not very flight-footed pursuers hard on its heels. This Chimera has got egg on its face many times before, but this one just about takes the biscuit. 275 point of broken chaos monster defeated by 2 crossbow dwarves. Pathetic! Right, it's Chaos turn 4 and it's time for Golruch to get his act together. With an unearthly roar, the dragon crashes into the side of the Iron Drakes. The chariot again tries its luck and again messes up the charge. In the movement phase, predictably, the stupid Chimera doesn't rally, but it only rolls a 3 and just about manages to stay on the board. However, he's going to be put out of his misery in the next dwarf turn as they chase him off the table. The movement phase also sees 2 other quite big calls from me. The first is not to charge those skull crushers into the side of the Iron Breakers. This is because I don't think they'll do too well there against that Dwarf King, and I also want the objective. So I walk into the deployment zone with the option to sidle in there in my remaining turns of the game. The other thing I decide to do is to give up on my Chaos Warriors. There just aren't enough of them left to be any threat now in combat to either of these major dwarf units. So, what I decide to do, rather than taking the charge from the Iron Breakers down the hill, is I do a swift reform on the warriors and move them backwards towards my deployment zone. There's still going to be a longish charge for those Iron Breakers there, but they're probably going to need about a 10 to get it. That's probably my Chaos Warriors' best chance of preserving their very many points and surviving the battle. The magic phase is again not a very good one, but Festus manages to get Blades of Putrefaction back on those overindulged Chaos Hounds. In the combat phase, Nurgle finally gets his payoff as those indulged pooches bite the gyrocopter to death. For his part, Lumpsucker and Gorach make a mess of the Iron Drakes. Lumpsucker stabs Grim Burluxon in the face, wounding him, and then Gorach gets all bitey and all stampy and eats 7 of the Iron Drakes. However, the elite dwarves have still got a rank and they stick. So, the shadows are beginning to lengthen on the battlefield as we move into Dwarf Turn 5. Terry takes what he knows to be the game-winning charge I've left him on the back of the Chaos Warriors needing an 11, and he doesn't get it. On the other side of the field, those 2 dwarf crossbowmen get to complete their coup de grace, or do they? So they elect to charge the Chimera, which just about managed to stay on the table last turn. And the creature, which is obliged to flee again, rolls a 111 and pulls up just an inch by the table edge. The dwarves themselves also don't manage to get into combat for the auto kill. This is absolutely ridiculous. The Chimera was defeated by 2 dwarves, then rolled a 3 on Swift Stride, followed by a 2 on Swift Stride to keep it in the remaining 6 inches of the table. Can it close out this outrageous series of dice and rally in the next turn? In the combat phase, the 6 Iron Drakes plus Grim Burluxon fight a lot better, and Gorach and Lumpsucker just kill another 3 of them, leaving just 2 Iron Drakes and Burluxon remaining, who stick on a 6. In Chaos Turn 5, the Chimera, with a massive groan and a roar, passes its rally test on a 5, and turns to face the 2 crossbow dwarves who had tormented them. That's how you do it, sonny. The Skullcrushers are content to ride into the dwarf deployment zone to try and challenge the objective. Then into the magic phase, and it's about time this magic dragon managed to do something. Well, he manages to get an infernal gateway on those crossbow dwarves that are in my deployment zone, which note I can do because it's a direct damage spell and not a magic missile. But Tzeentch spits in my face as I roll 2 strength 2 hits and do absolutely nothing once again. In the combat phase, though, the remaining Iron Drakes and Burluxon are finally stamped to pieces by Gorach and Lumpsucker, who turn now to face the Iron Breakers. Now, because of where Gorach is located, I'm able to turn him in such a way that gets out of the charge arc of the Iron Breakers, but Lumpsucker is not so lucky. He's going to be taking it in the next turn. On to the finale, and it's all to play for still. The Iron Breakers stampede down the hill into the doomed Lumpsucker. Meanwhile, the crossbow dwarves with a swift reform turn round and walk into my deployment zone. Only just, but they're still there. Now, can the miners come on and win the objective for the dwarves? Can they? Of course they can't. Still down below, wrapped in cartographical disputes, union disputes, or some other kind of dispute, these miners aren't turning up today. This is very unlucky for Terry. 6-turn battle, and the ambushers haven't turned up in all of their attempts. That's pretty outrageous. Come the combat phase, there's no real chance that Lumpsucker's going to have, other than by some hope managing to survive in a challenge, and that's what he does. The Dwarf King accepts it and unfurls his axe, passed down through many lineages of his house, and slaughters the pathetic battle standard bearer where he stands. However, there's nothing more these Ironbreakers can do now, because that's the final dwarf turn. Now, I think this is pretty tight going into the final Chaos turn. I decide that the Chariot probably isn't the best chance of defeating those 11 crossbow dwarves who are going to be denying me the objective. I decide it's going to be down to magic. So, I fly Gorok right in front of the crossbow dwarves, and a crucial magic phase begins. I roll 2 5s on the Winds of Magic, meaning I've got a big advantage in power dice, and all the corrupt sorceries of Tzeentch are powered into these 11 dwarves. First, it's the blue fire, which Terry stops. Then it's the bolt of change, which he elects to allow through, thinking there's only a potential 3 dwarves that can die to this bolt throw attack. Suffice to say, that is what happens, and the bolt skewers 3 dwarves, who then fail their toughness test and lose another couple. There's only 6 dwarves left now, as Gorok stares at them and powers up for his infernal gateway, which is going to blow them back to Grungy. I chuck all 6 dice at the gateway and get a double 6. It's going off all right. 2d6 hits at strength 2d6. I roll a dice and I get 8 hits at strength 7. A torrent of multicoloured cascading fire erupts from Gorok's mouth and powers into the 6 dwarves, casting smoke and ashes all over the battlefield. As the dust clears, many fallen dwarves litter the ground, but there's still, weakly flapping in the wind, that standard, held grimly aloft by 2 of the redoubtable warriors, staring into the whites of Gorok's eyes and denying the Chaos Army the objective that they thought was theirs. So, after a battle of heroic last stands and countless twists and turns, it's time to count up the victory points to find out who's won. So, in the final analysis and with a tied objective, we counted up the VPs and it was a dead heat, with Chaos being around 110 victory points ahead, but still falling within the bracket to make this game a draw, or 10-10 in the tournament system. I thought this was a really dramatic and exciting game, where the early game really fell in favour of the Dwarves with that devastating shooting, especially the Iron Drakes, who really cut through my regenerating units. There were also a couple of really narrow scrapes here for some important units. The Chaos Warriors, only with around 6 of them left, retreating to lick their wounds. The Chimera, defeated humiliatingly by 2 dwarf crossbowmen, but suddenly, somehow managing to stick on the table and deny the dwarves those points. And then, both dwarf crossbow units, down to just 2 men each, really proving that you should never, ever give up. Speaking from a more strategic point of view, I think the dwarves with their Stroller's runes, and getting the first turn as well, really had me in some trouble, and those Iron Drakes, with Grim Burluxon, could seriously damage my regenerating units. Given the position I was in turn 1, without my trolls, and with the Chaos Warriors staring down the barrels of all that shooting, I think I got the calculation about right. I was always going to be able to destroy the crossbow unit on the left, even though that actually didn't happen, but it was as near a certainty as could be counted on it. And the Chaos Warriors managed to survive the battle by bailing at a crucial moment, and Terry was not able to get the long bomb charge with the Iron Breakers that would obviously have given him a heavy victory in the game. I decided that the Iron Breakers, after I'd lost my warriors and my trolls, were realistically going to be too tough for me to have much to do with, given the magical item loadout on the Dwarf Lord in there. So then it really fell to Gorach to try and magic the dwarves off, and he wasn't really successful in doing that. He didn't manage to kill the gyrocopter despite a lot of spells being cast on it, and while he did fight very well in hand-to-hand combat against the Iron Drakes, teaming up with the BSB, he wasn't quite able to blow up those 11 crossbow dwarves at the end of the game. From the Dwarfs' perspective, the obvious really unlucky thing was that miner unit, which didn't turn up at all during the game and obviously counted as destroyed at the end. But at least the crossbow dwarves were still able to draw the dwarves the objective. However, if that miner unit had popped on the board in turn 6, the dwarves would have got a 500 victory point bonus, and that would have carried them to a respectable win, but it wasn't to be. So that's all folks, and I hope you enjoyed seeing the evil, nasty, mean forces of chaos in action, trying to stamp all over its opponents and not really succeeding on this occasion. Maybe next time you'll get to see the wretched demon in action who's appeared on some of my other videos, actually getting his hands dirty and doing a battle for a change. Anyway, and finally, and I'll put on my nice chivalrous Bretonian voice to say this, I'd like to thank everyone who has commented on my video, liked and subscribed. I've been very flattered by the amount of attention that I've got, and I'm encouraged to make many more of these battle reports. So thank you, and good night.